coup de projecteur de l'éclaireur, Pascal Clairot avec vous. Je reçois aujourd'hui Thomas Fazi et nous allons parler de la Commission européenne qui se comporte comme USAID. Thomas Fazi est journaliste et chercheur, c'est un spécialiste des affaires européennes. Vous pouvez le lire dans les colonnes de Unheard, nos collègues britanniques, ou bien dans Compact Magazine, ou enfin sur son Substack. Il vient de publier pour le compte du think tank MCC Bruxelles un rapport particulièrement inquiétant dans lequel il montre que la Commission européenne a utilisé des budgets européens non seulement pour propagandiser les populations européennes, mais également pour mener de véritables opérations de guerre de l'information, des opérations psychologiques contre les gouvernements d'États membres de l'Union européenne se montrant eurosceptiques. Thomas Fazi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. If that's okay with you, let's start with what's happening in Brussels and what seems to be the fallback of the US deep states in Europe.
So, well, first of all, thanks for having me, and hello to everyone who's listening in. Yeah, so I think there's kind of different layers to understand what's happening in Europe. The absolute and utter madness that's happening in Europe at the moment. This kind of Trump trying to clumsily bring an end to the conflict in Ukraine, and the Europeans kind of for the first time in decades standing up to the US in order to double down on this war that has proven absolutely disastrous, not only obviously for Ukraine, but also for Europe in economic and geopolitical terms. And I would argue that this was not a coincidence, but in fact was one of America's sort of unstated aims in this war, not just to use Ukraine as a proxy to bleed Russia, but also to use the conflict as a way of weakening Europe as well, weakening it economically and geopolitically by getting Europe to essentially divorce from Russia economically, and in doing so make Europe economically and even geopolitically much more dependent on the US, and this maybe not all of the US's goals in this war have been achieved, but I would say that this is definitely a goal that has been achieved. If we look at the state, what has happened over the course of the past 3 years and where Europe is at now, I would say that this goal has been achieved. The US has succeeded in driving a wedge between Europe and Russia, and especially Germany and Russia, in getting Europe to decouple from Russia economically, especially insofar as energy is concerned. And now we're to a large degree dependent on the import of American LNG for energy needs, which this is getting to this point has been an American geostrategic imperative for a very long time, and in fact, America has been very open about it. This is why America, throughout the years, strongly opposed the construction of Nord Stream 2, and Trump's first administration was probably the administration that more than any other really tried to sort of stop the construction of Nord Stream 2 through sanctions and other forms of economic pressure on Germany, which ultimately they slowed down the project, but they ultimately failed. And I think it's important to say this because it's important to realize that Ukraine, unlike what Trump is saying, was not it's not all the fault of the Biden administration. This is kind of the narrative that Trump is running with. Oh, Biden is solely responsible for this war, and now I'm going to put an end to it. Things are a bit more complicated. Ukraine is a decades-long, at least 2 decades-long imperial project that, in fact, has spanned multiple administrations, including Trump's first administration, which played a key role in providing, for the first time, in fact, ever, lethal weaponry to Ukraine, and which proved pivotal in the sort of NATOization, de facto NATOization of Ukraine. So fast forward into today, how should we explain this completely suicidal stance of European governments, again, which finally would have a chance to put an end to a war which has been absolutely disastrous for Europe, but instead are doing their best to sabotage Trump's peace efforts and get the war to continue, basically. And I would say that in the short term, for the time being, they have achieved that aim. I think, if we look at just how much the narrative has shifted just over the course of the past week. So it was clear, I think the sort of standoff between Zelensky and Trump and Vance in the White House was really a watershed moment. I think Trump was largely in control of the narrative up until that point, which is why the Europeans were scrambling, panicking. They didn't know what to do. We had Macron's meeting of heads of states in Paris, but they really weren't going anywhere. They were really grasping at straws, and they seemed rather confused and really destined to kind of be sort of passive bystanders to the resolution of the conflict negotiated by the big boys, i.e. the US and Russia. After the kind of Oval Office meltdown, things changed a lot, and I think Europe now has sort of the pro-war party in Europe once again has the upper hand. And I think that meeting, is partly to blame for that. I think Trump really kind of served this on a platter to the pro-war party, not just in Europe, but in the US as well. But I mean, I think, the kind of public humiliation of Zelensky was, very bad, sort of a bad move from a strategic perspective, because it really, brought a lot of grist to the European pro-party's mill. And
if I may just interrupt, Zelensky did call J.D. Vance sucha, which means son of a bitch. He did let that out.
Yeah.
Actually did it.
Yeah, no, I saw that. I mean, I saw that afterwards. I saw the translations. And although I think that didn't have much of a bearing on the meeting itself, because I don't think that Vance understood what he said. So, I mean, the question is, so I guess, one could elaborate a lot about, why, what went down actually happened. Was it just a completely, was it just, just an unscripted meltdown, on the parts of both the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian president and Trump and Vance, or was it, or was the event somewhat staged to some extent? And a lot of people have suggested that maybe Trump staged it himself. But I think if you look at the sort of the whole video, it's 50 minutes, and throughout most of the video, Trump was quite cordial to Zelensky, and clearly Zelensky is the one that escalates the tension towards the end of that conversation. And then the question becomes, again, did Zelensky simply lose his temper, or was maybe this kind of staged by Zelensky in order to kind of get the sympathy of European public opinion, and use that against Trump and against Trump's attempts to sort of force a peace plan on Ukraine, because it's pretty clear that, well, maybe we shouldn't speak of Ukraine, let's talk about Zelensky, to force a plan on Zelensky, because it's clear that Zelensky does not want peace. He's got, his own reasons for wanting the war to continue, chiefly the fact that if the war comes to an end, his political career is almost certainly finished. I think we don't realize how much resentment there is in Ukraine against Zelensky, who has, essentially transformed Ukraine into a sort of a hyper-militarized police state where there is no freedom of speech, there is no freedom to speak out against the war, where people are getting dragged off the street and being sent to the front to be where they face near certain death. So I think there's a lot of resentment against Zelensky, and so he knows that politically, I think his career is most likely finished if this war comes to an end. But in even sort of more extreme terms, his very life could be in danger. And so he's kind of, sort of become, sort of he has his own interests for wanting this war to continue, which is why, again, sort of if we play along with this sort of, speculative narrative, why he may have had an interest in sort of creating that scene in the White House. But then, of course, there are other interested parties as well. First and foremost, the Europeans, who, from day one, since Trump sort of began the negotiations with Russia, have really made it very clear that they were terrified at this prospect. And so they've been, since day one, they've been trying to sabotage this, in every possible way. And to some extent, I would say, yes, as I was saying, now they have succeeded in doing that, because it looks like for the time being that, the Europeans are going to sort of step up and allow Ukraine to continue this proxy war for a while. Of course, it can't go on for, that long. And of course, this is absolutely tragic for Ukraine, because the longer the war continues and the worse Ukraine's negotiating position becomes. So Ukraine is likely going to lose not just more men, but more territories as the war continues. But so, of course, the real question is, why are the Europeans insisting on this completely suicidal strategy? And of course, the question is, again, just as with Ukraine, where you have to differentiate between what Ukraine's sort of objective interests are, and clearly, Ukraine's interests as a country, as a nation, lie in ending this war as soon as possible. But the country's interests are not necessarily aligned with the interests of the Zelensky regime. And of course, the same goes for Europe. I mean, what Europe's core interest clearly lies in this war ending as soon as possible, and in fact, in renormalizing and reestablishing economic and political and diplomatic relations with Russia as soon as possible. This is pretty straightforward. But again, the interests of sort of the objective interests of Europe and of the European peoples are not aligned with the interests of the current EU leadership, and in fact, even extra EU leadership if we include the UK, which have an interest in this war continuing. They have an interest in this war continuing because they've invested so much in it that they can't admit defeat. Admitting defeat now would be a massive political blow for a leadership that is already, seriously delegitimized, which already is, has very serious problems of, has incredibly low levels of popular consensus, of popular support. This is this is the most illegitimate sort of crop of leaders that Europe has ever had. And this is why they're cracking down on democracy in every possible way, including now even, not just engaging in rampant censorship and propaganda, but as we are witnessing now in Romania, just outright rigging, canceling elections and now rigging elections by, this is just yesterday's news, barring the leading candidate in the Romanian elections, Georgescu, from actually running in the upcoming elections, which is just, which is just absolutely crazy. But I think it tells you the kind of, just how desperate the EU leadership is at the moment. And so they see this war as a way of, continuing this war is a way for them to maintain their grip on power and sort of avoid the inevitable, confronting the inevitable, which will come at some point, but they're trying to sort of push that can down the road as much as possible, confronting the political consequences of defeat in Ukraine, because they have invested really so much in it, in terms not just of their own political capital, but I mean, they've also, you also have to consider what I was saying earlier, the huge, and this is a much more serious issue than, for example, in the US, where, there hasn't been much of an economic blowback. In fact, you could say that the US has benefited, economically in the short term, at least, from this war, especially in terms of increased energy exports to Europe. But Europe, this is for Europe, it's been the opposite. Europeans have suffered gravely from this war, including massive increase in sort of energy poverty rates and, etc. inflation and so on. And so the Europeans just can't turn around and say, yeah, we've lost, not only have we lost the war in Ukraine, but in fact, if they were to go along with Trump's narrative, they would even have to admit that not only have they lost this war, but that they are responsible for this war, for simply blindly following, most recently the Biden administration in waging this disastrous proxy war. And so they want this war to continue. And again, maintaining heightened tensions with Russia is also a way of sort of maintaining a state, sort of a permanent state of exception, a permanent state of emergency that then justifies crackdowns on civil liberties, crackdowns on democracy, crackdowns on dissent, which is, in the name of, fighting what they consider fifth columns of a country that we are de facto at war with, i.e. Russia. And by fifth columns, of course, this means anyone who happens to disagree with sort of a never-ending proxy war in Ukraine. So you can see why they would have an interest in this war continuing. And I think this is one layer. But I think there's also a deeper layer. And I think deep is, the right word here, because I think we have to consider the possibility that the Europeans aren't acting alone, but may in fact be coordinating with factions of the US deep state, which of course, are still there. I mean, it's not like Trump. I mean, these are very entrenched systems of power, and an administration, especially in a few weeks, cannot overturn those systems of power completely. And so, of course, the U.S. deep state is still very much entrenched and very much in power, within the deep within the U.S. power system, the U.S. bureaucracy, and even beyond that, there are very, very powerful private interests. First and foremost, the U.S. military-industrial complex, which, and all these factions have an interest in the war continuing. And so, I say it's not that far-fetched to imagine that the Europeans are, in fact, coordinating with, what we may call the liberal globalist, which is, of course, the dominant faction of the U.S. deep state, and then sort of more on the surface, the Democratic establishment, the Democratic Party establishment in the US. I think this kind of explains also the boldness of Europeans. I mean, these are pretty fickle leaders, but lately we've seen very bold statements about, how Europe has to, stand up for America. And, I mean, the Europeans haven't taken a stand against America, when they needed to, throughout, for decades, even as the US was dragging Europe into, one disastrous war after another. And sort of, vassalizing Europe in countless ways. And now they finally find the strength and the courage to stand up. It's clear that there's something fishy going on here. And I think, part of explaining this, or part of the way to explain this is, yes, basically assuming that, they feel they have their backs covered by very powerful elements within the US as well, or within the kind of transatlantic system, more in general. And this doesn't kind of exculpate the Europeans. The Europeans clearly have their very serious responsibilities for what is happening, but I think we need to sort of have a broader picture of what is happening. And I think this sort of partly, at least, explains what's going on here. I think we have to assume that there are elements within the US that are using Europe to kind of sabotage Trump and to sabotage his peace overtures. And yes, and I think this is kind of where we're at the moment. And I think this, also means that this narrative that now, European leaders are spinning, backed up, of course, by the European mainstream media, of a, quote unquote, rift between Europe and the US. I think this is a very simplistic reading of what's happening. I mean, I don't see much of seen in this terms, this isn't so much a rift between Europe and the US. It's more, I would say, a rift within the transatlantic, and even more specifically within the US establishment itself, which is kind of now playing out in Europe. So I think this is kind of what we're, one of the factors at play here, at least.
Well, the proxy always ends up a patsy. I mean, no matter what. But to come back on the European project and how the US used it, it's been going on for ages, basically from the start, because the European Community for Carbon Steel was created, correct me if I'm wrong, to make sure that Western Europe could not access cheap and high-quality coal after the Second World War from the Warsaw Pact countries, so that the European industry, mainly the steel industry, would not rise up as a major competitor for the US one. Wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the many myths about the European Union, this is probably maybe the biggest, in fact, at least in terms of kind of its historical origins, is that the EU was created as a counterbalance, as a counterweight to American power. And this has been a very sort of powerful narrative, and in fact has been used to enlist support for the European Union, even sort of on the, you could say, sort of anti-Atlanticist left, which have fallen for this narrative of the European Union as sort of, at the very least, kind of a necessary evil in order for Europe to finally stand up to America. And in fact, this is largely a myth. In fact, this wouldn't explain why the US, the Americans, really from the earliest days of the post-war period have been among the strongest supporters for European integration. And in fact, we know that the CIA was channeling large amounts of money to the various European federalist movements in the early post-war years.
Jean Monnet, de Gasperi,
Exactly.
SPAC, and all that gang, huh?
Exactly. And then later on, people like Spinelli, and, these people were all strongly supported by, both overtly and covertly supported by the US. So the US has been a, key driver in the European integration project. And I think it's not hard to understand why. So sort of in kind of, from a Cold War perspective, the US saw the need to unite Europe, to have a united Europe as a kind of Western bulwark against the Soviet Union, basically. And so they wanted to sort of have Europe united in a as a Western bloc. As opposed, as a counterweight, not to the US, but to the Soviet Union, in fact. And again, that project, you could say, largely succeeded. And of course, then there were, actions that were also, of course, taken out within individual countries to ensure that those countries would remain within the kind of the Western sphere of influence, and countries like Italy and my country, but of course also France and Germany were sort of key countries that where the US went to get great lengths to ensure that any politician that truly had sort of their respective countries' autonomy and European autonomy more in general at heart would not get very far. And this has, of course, included various kind of assassinations of key politicians and not just politicians, businessmen as well, etc., in various European countries, especially in the kind of 70s and 80s. So there's a long history.
Especially in Italy, yeah.
Sorry?
Aldo Moro.
Well, Aldo Moro is obviously, I think, probably the most prominent example of, when we're talking of
Olof Palme.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I would say Olof Palme and Aldo Moro are definitely the two key examples of what today we will call sort of sovereigntist European politicians that were, that died in mysterious circumstances, but almost certainly, in killings that involved the US intelligence services and CIA first and foremost. There's a lot of evidence for this. And there are other similar examples throughout Europe. So this is how far the US has gone to ensure sort of, its strategic domination of Europe. But the European Union has been a key element of this strategy of control. And in broader terms, you can see why the US would sort of see it useful to have a single centralized administration that would, that would wield sort of a great degree of economic and control over Europe. In the knowledge that sort of centralized administration, would be under American control. They sort of, and the Americans kind of took this for granted, given the longstanding linkages that they built, ever since the early days of the post-war period. And so, that created a situation where, once the EU in its current form came about, essentially, the Americans already had countless back channels to influence, not just individual governments, but the European Union itself. And I think this kind of explains why, especially under von der Leyen's administration, we've seen the European Union align itself much more with the U.S. administration than in many cases with the EU's own member states, basically, So you could really say
basically, which leads us to your reports, your latest reports for the MCC Brussels, where you clearly show that the European Union has been using its own monies against the government of EU member states and the people of the European Union. Yeah. Can you explain to us what you found out? Because that's worrying.
Yeah, it's very worrying indeed. And so, we've all heard of by now USAID, or let's just call it USAID for simplicity, and how this this US body formerly devoted to supporting development projects in poor countries and underdeveloped countries, etc., was in fact a front, largely for a kind of a CIA front for external propaganda and external destabilization operations aimed at using local NGOs in third countries to influence domestic public opinion in those countries, but even more concerningly, to in fact destabilize and attempt to, in some cases successfully, regime change governments and administrations that were seen as hostile to U.S. interests, U.S. economic and geopolitical interests. And we know that USAID played a crucial role behind many of the so-called color revolutions in the post-Soviet sphere, and of course more recently and sort of more pressingly in Ukraine and in the kind of events that led up to the 2014 US-led coup. So this has been a very pernicious organization that has essentially weaponized and in some cases kind of created an artificial civil society in third countries in order to further its U.S. interests. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the European Commission operates a very similar sort of system, and the European Commission more specifically operates a program which was introduced in 2021. Which is called a SERVE program. That's a Citizens Equality, Rights and Values program, which is officially, aimed at promoting quote unquote EU values, basically. And that should already raise a few red flags, because that's clearly a very vague term. I mean, yes, we all know what the EU's official values are: democracy, human rights, rule of law. Yeah, these are all things that, sort of taken at face value, we all support. But of course, we also know that the European Union has sort of trampled upon all of these principles, and ever since its inception. And in fact, you could say that its very existence is a negation of these principles, especially the principle of democracy, insofar as the European Union is not just structurally undemocratic, but has been the key sort of I would say an absolutely key institution in rolling back democracy across Europe over the past few decades. And in fact, when you look at what this program is actually funding, we see that there's a lot of stuff that, isn't just about democracy or human rights, but in fact, we see not just, public money being used to promote, very one-sided interpretations of the European Union's values. And so we see a lot of projects that in fact aimed at promoting specific ideologies and specific political views. Essentially, there's a lot of projects that are aimed at promoting, genderism and, climatism or, multiculturalism. And these represent sort of political views and ideologies that aren't shared by, a large number of, a large part of the European population, especially in more conservative leaning countries like, in Central and Eastern Europe. So already we see how this money is used to promote sort of political ideologies that that the ruling classes claim to hold dear, but that are not necessarily shared by a lot of people across Europe. So already we see a very kind of politicized and biased use of public money. But I think even worse is the fact that a lot of these projects aren't in fact aimed at promoting any specific ideology whatsoever, but simply at promoting the European Union and the idea of European integration itself. And this is even more concerning, because this is something that is for which there's even less of a consensus across Europe. In fact, we're seeing greater and greater resistance against an opposition to the European Union, to the idea of greater European integration, greater federalization. This is what a lot of the kind of neo-populist movements and parties across Europe are opposed to. And so essentially what we have is, and it's important to understand that all these projects are sort of channeled through third parties. So NGOs, think tanks, civil society organizations of various kinds. So in a manner very similar to how USAID operates. So, but what it amounts to is in fact propaganda, or what I call in the report propaganda by proxy, because it's not an official communications campaign by the Commission is a form of propaganda. So you have a billboard in the street, that's kind of pretty straightforward propaganda. But if you're using supposedly independent actors such as NGOs to in fact promote your views, promote your ideologies, and promote yourself ultimately, i.e. sort of the European Union and the European Commission's goal of greater integration, you're in fact engaging in propaganda by proxy. And that's very, that's problematic in itself, but it's even sort of more concerning because just like USAID, what you're doing is you're completely corrupting what civil society should be. So civil society, if it's, in its most fundamental sense, is supposed to be a check on power, a check on governments, where, independent actors, are supposed to advocate for and convey sort of ideas and that emerge organically and spontaneously from civil society, and this may include even, of course, engaging in opposition against governments. And in fact, I would say that that's a healthy thing, and we need more of that. But in fact, when you have a system where a lot of these NGOs are in fact almost entirely, if not fully, dependent on the European Commission and similar bodies, both private as well as other foreign bodies. But if we limit ourselves to the European Commission, we see that a lot in Europe, a lot of these NGOs are in fact very heavily reliant on European Commission money. And when you see that what they do is in fact engage in the promotion of the European Union, of the European Commission's, i.e. their funders, propaganda, basically, then you have a problem. Then you have European civil society being co-opted, being weaponized, in order to, in fact, invert what should be the role of civil society. So no longer is civil society something that is, a check on power and something that is used to convey ideas that emerge from society, vis-a-vis governments and institutions. In fact, you see a reversal of this. You see supposedly independent NGOs and supposedly independent civil society organizations, which are in fact fully organic to the kind of power system in the European Union, and which are in fact used to convey to civil society the ideologies and the political views and political goals of the kind of European establishment. So this is a complete inversion of what civil society should do, and it's
with taxpayers' money on top of that. So civil society is paying taxes to get propagandized. Basically.
Yeah, this is our money. Of course, this is all coming from the European Union's budget, which is paid for by member states and ultimately by each and every one of us, insofar as most of us, if not all of us, pay taxes. And so, in fact, it's it really is a gross misuse of public money. And I think if any government was doing this, it would be a scandal. And instead here we have the European Union doing this on a massive supranational continental scale, so it's even worse. But the idea of using public money to essentially, propagandize, the very people who are paying you, basically, whose money you rely on for these operations, I think is particularly perverse, and it is particularly worrying when this occurs, when these operations are targeted at the citizens and governments of countries that are ruled by more conservative leaning governments, or more Eurosceptic, or these days NATO skeptic or Ukraine skeptic governments. And of course, we can, our mind instantly goes to Poland under the previous government, Orban's Hungary, of course, Romania, and
Slovakia,
more recently Slovakia. So these countries have all been the target of, essentially, I would call, foreign interference operations, not just by USAID, which of course was very present in these countries, and maybe to some extent still is, despite the sort of cutting of the funding by Trump, but have all been a target of sort of EU propaganda operations. So a lot of money has been channeled, into these countries, to NGOs and think tanks that operate in these countries, and academic institutions, etc., to essentially engage in activities, aimed at the governments in power. And again, this is, the EU loves to, there's no favorite topic these days among EU sort of establishment elites, their foreign interference and how supposedly nefarious foreign governments, first and foremost, Russia, and then, in second degree, China, are interfering, supposedly interfering in the, electoral processes and democratic processes across Europe. But in fact, I would say that there's no single body engages more in foreign interference within Europe than the European Union itself, specifically the European Commission. European Commission today is sort of driving the sort of online censorship projects in the form of the Digital Services Act, but is also engaged in essentially acts of foreign destabilization. And again, here we see a complete reversal of what civil society should do. So I mean, there's nothing wrong in, of course, a civil society organization challenging the government on policies that it doesn't agree with, So, there's nothing wrong in a conservative country for a liberal progressive NGO or think tank to challenge that government. I think that's a healthy democratic activity, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when you have those same organizations taking money from, foreign, essentially what you could say are foreign institutions, in the case of USAID, or, supranational institutions that are, within the European Union, i.e. the European Commission, are taking these institutions' monies, which happen to be very hostile to the governments in your country, and you're using that money to engage in political activities aimed at a democratically elected government, then
they are basically undermining the democratic debate, period.
Exactly. So essentially you have a reversal of what should be, what should be the democratic role played by NGOs. Here, essentially what we have here is NGOs being weaponized by foreign interests to destabilize, not ideally, regime change, governments that are considered hostile to the kind of EU NATO agenda. So they're engaged, and so you're effectively very seriously blurring the line between legitimate civil society activity and sort of foreign destabilization. And I think this is very dangerous, of course, for a number of reasons, but also because it inevitably ends up essentially delegitimizing all NGOs. And so I think, what we're witnessing now, and we're seeing that, for example, even with USAID. So, some of that money was going to, legitimate, activities that were actually aimed at actually helping people, Not all money, not all the USAID money was being used for propaganda. But of course, because of the backlash against the kind of weaponization of NGOs, then you see even sort of, legitimate NGOs that are doing good work being swept up in the anti-NGO backlash. And that's what we're witnessing, in a lot of either post-Soviet countries or Eastern countries, because those have been the countries that have been most heavily targeted by these sort of pro-regime NGOs, pro-EU regime NGOs, and so I think it's really in everyone's interest, and it's in European society's interest in really blowing open this black box, because what I show in the report is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure there's a lot more research to be done, and we're digging, we're continuing to dig into the data, and a lot of more shit is coming to the surface, and so we'll be publishing more on this very soon. So it's in everyone's interest to blow open this black box, but it's also in the interest of civil society, genuine civil society and genuine NGOs, for us to be able to distinguish between legitimate NGOs and essentially engineered or artificial NGOs and artificial civil society. The first is I would say a key prerequisite for democracy. The second is a serious danger to democracy.
Well, thank you. It's 4 now, so I'm going to just so you know, my colleague Patricia Sarazek is working on is currently investigating the 132 million euros a year that the EC is paying to Havas to run advertising campaigns, so-called advertising campaign in Europe. That's going to be a funny one.
This is just one example of why the kind of we really don't have a clear number, a clear figure in terms of how big the EU propaganda budget actually is, because in the report I mostly look at the sort of quote unquote official propaganda budget, which is this SERV program, but of course then you have a lot of programs that are in fact that have completely different aims. So other programs or other budgetary allocations which have completely different aims, which in fact, also end up being used for propaganda purposes. So one of the things that's emerging as we continue this research is how much money, for example, from the Horizon program is channeled to propaganda activities, and especially anti-fake news and anti-quote-unquote disinfo activities. Huge amounts of money. And Horizon is supposed to be the European Union's kind of R&D program, of which we need much more of in Europe. I mean, actual R&D, which is an area where, of course, we've been falling behind other kind of major industrialized nations for a very long time. And instead, what we see is huge amounts of money being redirected from, actual scientific research, from R&D towards essentially propaganda activities. And then you have other budgetary allocations, such as huge amounts of money are spent on marketing and communications, basically. And we're talking tens and tens of millions, hundreds of millions, which are paid to these huge PR and marketing companies. Havas is just one of them. But there are, dozens of media and advertisement organizations that get huge amounts of money. And again, it's not exactly clear what they do with this money. I mean, these are PR companies, so you would imagine that they're
the European Union refuses to give a list of what has been bought, what kind of services were bought with these monies, not to undermine private interests. That's the response, the reply we received. Funny, huh?
That's the official answer for everything. That's why they wouldn't publish the COVID vaccine contracts back in the day. And it's always about protecting private commercial interests, but which always seem to override the interests of European citizens and consumers. But yeah, so just thanks to the research that was done by, I think it was a Spanish sort of free speech advocacy group, and then then further research was done by the Italian newspaper Il Fatto Quotidiano. It emerged that 130 million euros that had been given to one of these PR agencies, Havas, was then awarded to various media outlets across Europe to essentially, engage in favorable coverage of the European elections, and especially favorable coverage of sort of mainstream parties. So this is just one example of how, in fact, money that is supposed to. So when you think of money that's allocated to PR and marketing, you don't think that is actually being used for covert advertising campaigns, where you're actually paying newspapers to write positively about the European Union. I would assume at least we're talking about TV campaigns, TV ads, billboards, that kind of stuff. But instead it turns out that probably a lot of that money is also being channeled to propaganda activities. And in fact, one thing that I'm specifically looking at now is EU funding of media. So kind of relates to what you said Pascal is looking into.
Huge issue. I mean, this has been going on for quite a while, by the way. That's a big problem. I mean, because media are also becoming dependent of this type of funding, especially the mainstreams, because nobody listens or watches them or buys them anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, it's actually, more challenging to prove. So I guess they've been slightly smarter about the way they've gone about this, because in most cases, at least that's what I'm sort of coming across, even though, I mean, I've just kind of began this sort of individual, this kind of focus on media, is that in most cases, the money isn't channeled. They're smart enough not to channel the money directly, is kind of from the European Commission to the media outlets. Even though a lot of money, interestingly, is channeled to news agencies, which I found very interesting. So, ANSA in Italy and
AFP in France, Reuters in the UK.
Exactly. All the big names are there. Reuters is there. And that makes sense to the extent that, the news agencies to a large degree today do set the narrative for the mainstream media. It would make sense that, instead of some kind of trying to corrupt every single individual news outlet, even though I'm sure that happens as well, you focus on controlling the narrative of the real news gatekeepers, you could say, which are the press agencies, because in most cases, the mainstream media outlets, they just run with whatever the news agencies say. So once you control the narrative at the news agency level, then you've got sort of a big chunk of your job already done. But so when it comes to kind of funding two news outlets, what I've realized is that they're quite smart in the sense that they go through third parties,
implementing partners.
Yes, they go through partners. In many cases, NGOs, again, interestingly, several media projects, i.e., projects that, aimed at quote unquote supporting independent media, in difficult, quote unquote difficult situations, such as, countries governed by quote unquote illiberal forces, and we know which countries they're talking about, are in fact managed by the Open Society foundations, i.e. George Soros's Open Society Foundation. So not only is the Open Society funding a lot of civil society in these countries, but the Open Society itself is receiving funding from the European Commission to influence and civil society. And so, so it's these third parties that then sub-award the money to the media outlets. So that requires a bit more work, because you won't find a lot of you won't find who the recipients are simply by going through the EU's databases. So it requires a bit more work, but we'll get there for sure.
Thomas Fazi, thank you very much.